I'm Mr. Ramsey, saving Western civilization, one student at a time. In our last lecture, we discussed the fall of the Romanov family, in particular Tsar Nicholas II and his reign as the last Romanov Tsar or king of Russia. Okay, and that happened on March 15th, 1917. Once that happens, the Russian people set up the provisional government, which is basically who was representing the legislative body, which in Russia they call the Duma. Okay, and there was two groups that were competing for power. One was the people in the Duma, which basically represented the middle class, and the other people were the Soviets, or worker councils. I guess we could say they were what we could say equivalent to labor unions. So you had the Soviets that represented the workers, and you had the Duma that represented the, you could say all people of Russia, but it was predominantly dominated by the middle class. Okay? And what I mean by Soviet, just to make sure you understand, it was the Soviet of workers and soldiers' deputies. And the most famous one was actually in Petrograd, where the capital city was. Okay? The man that was responsible, or at least running the show, when the provisional government was in play from February of 1917, March of 1917 to November of 1917, was Alexander Kerensky. Okay? He actually could talk to both the Soviet councils and also the people in the Duma. Okay? And what the Soviet Petrograd workers wanted was peace, they wanted land, and they wanted control of the factory workers. All right, and he could talk to both of them and also the people that represented themselves in the Duma. Okay? Now, but the people that really were the revolutionaries, what we now call communists. And communists were divided into two groups. We had one that was called the Mensheviks, and one was the Bolsheviks. And the leader of the Bolsheviks was Vladimir Lenin. Okay? And the difference between the two was this. The Mensheviks wanted Russia to go to the different stages of history. The third stage being the capitalist stage, and then finally the fourth stage would be the Soviet workers' paradise. And they said that you had to gradually go through this. And they'd say that the Mensheviks would argue that actually the Russia people are still agricultural. They haven't gone to the industrial age. But Lenin wouldn't hear of it, and his Bolsheviks wouldn't hear of it. He said he wanted revolution, and he wanted revolution now. Okay? And so just to talk about Vladimir Lenin, he was actually exiled to Siberia in 1895. Okay? And then when he was released from his exile, he went to Europe and then later settled in Switzerland. And he stays there during World War I. And it's in 1917 that the German government ships him off to Russia so that he can help overthrow the Tsar and knock them out of the war. Okay, because during the war, Lenin's been calling for peace. He and I believe the Pope were the only two people that actually calling for peace during the war. Woodrow Wilson was calling for a little bit, and then he went a war without victors. But we'll talk about Woodrow Wilson later at the our last lecture at the Council of Versailles. Not the Council, the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, when they met at Versailles. Okay. Anyway, so Lenin, when he is sent back to Russia, he promises the Russian people three major things. He promises them peace to get them out of the war, land, so he's going to collectivize and give the land supposedly to the farmers, and bread. Once they're collectivized, which means the government's going to run the land, they'll have an abundance amount of bread, and so they don't have to worry about anything. Okay? So Lenin's over there trying to actually overthrow the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky. And by the summer of 1917, because you have to remember you have the Romanov Tsar Nicholas II stepping down. Then you have Alexander Kerensky running the provisional government, and that's from March of 1917 all the way to November of 1917. And during the summer of 1917, there was demonstrations against the provisional government. And Alexander Kerensky blamed those demonstrations on the Bolsheviks and their leader, Vladimir Lenin. And so in the summer of 1917, he tried to arrest all the Bolshevik leaders he could get his hand on. Okay? But it doesn't work, okay? Because on November 7th, 1917, Lenin and his Bolshevik revolution have a coup d'etat. They overthrow the provisional government, and they're the ones that are actually leading the Russian people. And so, once he gains power, he sets up a socialistic state where there's no private property, that he supposedly gives out the land to the people, the peasants in particular, which is called collectivization, which is actually a disaster. Every time a communist government gives up land of collectivization, they actually end up starving the people. And then they also hand over the factories to the workers, okay, giving control over those factories by the workers, which actually cuts down in manufacturing goods. It lowers the production of the country, because it was the middle class that was actually running. They know how to run factories, okay? Workers know how to work in the factory, but the middle class, or the business owners, actually know how to order stuff or run the factory. And so it was a total disaster. Same thing with the collectivization of the farms. Anyway, okay, so Bolsheviks, Lenin and his Bolsheviks set up a socialist state in Russia, okay, which they call themselves communist, on the ideas of Marx and also on the ideas of Lenin, okay? And Lenin wants to spread his revolution worldwide. He believes that all the world should be communist. And he sets up an organization called the Comintern, where the Comintern would spread his idea of peace, land, and bread for the entire world. Okay, peace to get them out of the war, land, that all the workers would have all the land that they need because it's controlled by the state. Okay, and bread, once the paradise, the utopian paradise that Marx had envisioned in his Communist Manifesto. Okay, now the first step for Lenin was to get Russia out of the war. And so what he does is, in 1918, he signs an agreement with Germany, and it's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which basically gives Germany Poland, the Baltic states, the Ukrainian areas, all to Germany, okay? And once they do that, the Germans are going to take all their forces and try to make a major push in the West, okay? It fails, but they're going to take all their soldiers from the east and move them to the west, okay? And the reason why they're allowed to do that is because Lenin signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, okay, with Germany, okay? Once this happens, though, the peace of Lenin does not come, because there's a civil war between the Reds, who are the communists, the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, who is everyone else. You could be a royalist, you could be a constitutionalist, you could be middle class, you can be a socialist, but you didn't want a total revolution like on the basis of Lenin. And so you have a civil war from 1918 to 1921. And the man that's responsible for leading the Russian army, the Red Army, the Workers' Army, is Leon Trotsky. He organized the Red Army, and he is brutal by killing and murdering for 3 years. Okay? And during that time, peasants and workers are going to starve. And the reason why that happens is because they set up this thing called war communism, which Lenin takes control of all the industry, all the farming in Russia, and he makes the workers and the peasants and the farmers have sent all produce, all material goods to the capital, to the cities. Okay? And in the process, he sets up a terror regime. And the team that's responsible for that terror regime is the secret police called Cheka, which is more known now as the KGB. But they're the same organization: GPU, Cheka, NKVD, KGB. They're all the same organization. They're so ruthless they have to change their name roughly every 20 years. Okay? So by 1921, Russia, under Vladimir Lenin, has now established their totalitarian state. So next week we'll talk about the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. Hope you enjoyed.